Honestly, Richard, Maya's been a waste of money since college, my mother said, her voice carrying across the white tablecloth at Morton's Steakhouse in Manhattan, and I watched her boss Richard Chen's expression shift from polite dinner conversation to visible discomfort as the words settled over our table like a toxic cloud. It was a Thursday evening in September, the kind of crisp, early fall night when the city felt alive with possibility. And here I was at 28 years old, sitting in a leather booth surrounded by the low murmur of expense account dinners and clinking wine glasses, listening to my mother catalog my failures for her supervisor at Goldman Sachs. The restaurant was the kind of place where power brokers closed deals over dry-aged ribeyes and bottles of wine that cost more than some people's monthly rent, all dark wood and dim lighting that was supposed to feel intimate, but tonight just felt suffocating. My father sat to my left, studying his water glass with the intense focus of a man who had perfected the art of disappearing while remaining physically present, his salt and pepper hair catching the light from the small table lamp. Richard Chen, a senior managing director in my mother's division, sat across from me next to my mother, and I could see him trying to maintain his professional composure, even as my mother continued her familiar litany of disappointments. I mean, we spent $280,000 on MIT, and what does she have to show for it? My mother said, gesturing at me with her wine glass, the Cabernet inside it probably worth more than she thought I made in a week. She was wearing her pearl necklace, the one she saved for important occasions, and her black Armani suit that she'd bought specifically for dinners with senior management. Her hair was styled in the same precise bob she'd maintained for the last 15 years, not a strand out of place. Everything about her radiating the controlled perfection she'd always demanded from her surroundings and found so consistently lacking in me. I sat there in my simple black dress from Everlane, the one I'd thrown on after a 12-hour day at my office in Soma, having caught a last-minute flight from San Francisco, because my mother had insisted this dinner was important, that it would mean a lot to her if her whole family was there. Richard had ordered the chef's tasting menu for the table, and our appetizers sat half-eaten in front of us, seared scallops that probably cost $40 each and that I could barely taste past the familiar tightness in my throat that always accompanied these family gatherings. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. The pattern had started so early that I sometimes struggled to remember a time before it, back when I was 7 years old, and my brother Jason was 12, already showing the signs of the focused academic excellence that would eventually carry him through Princeton and then Johns Hopkins Medical School. I remembered sitting at our dining table in our house in Westchester, the one with the view of the Long Island Sound that my mother loved to mention at dinner parties, working on a science project about the solar system while Jason studied for his Latin exam, and my mother had walked past, glanced at my work, and said to my father, "Well, at least Jason inherited your intelligence." My father had said nothing, just retreated behind his newspaper the way he always did. And even at 7, I'd felt the sting of being found lacking in some essential way I didn't quite understand. By the time I was in middle school, the comparisons had become more pointed, more specific. Jason's straight A's versus my mix of A's and B's. Never mind that I was teaching myself to code and had built my first website at age 11. Jason's position as captain of the debate team versus my participation in robotics club, which my mother dismissed as playing with toys. When I got into MIT at 17, a full year early because I'd skipped a grade in math, my mother's first comment had been, "Well, it's not Harvard, but I suppose it's good for technical things." Jason had gone to Princeton. That was what mattered. The $280,000 price tag for my MIT education became a recurring theme, a number my mother wielded like a weapon at family gatherings, dinner conversations, phone calls with relatives. "Do you know what we're paying for Maya to go to MIT?" she'd say, as if the investment were a personal burden she bore with martyr-like patience. Never mind that Jason's Princeton undergraduate and Hopkins medical school education had cost nearly $500,000 total. That was different, she'd explain when I was foolish enough to point it out. Jason was going to be a surgeon. He was saving lives. What was I going to do with computer science? Build websites? The irony was that I'd loved MIT, had thrived there in ways I'd never been able to explain to my mother because she'd never asked. I'd found my people, other kids who thought in algorithms and stayed up until 3 in the morning debugging code and believed that technology could actually change the world. I'd graduated with a 3.9 GPA, had job offers from Google and Facebook, had professors who told me I had a gift for seeing solutions that others missed. My graduation day should have been a celebration, my parents sitting in Killian Court watching me receive my degree. But I mostly remembered my mother spending the entire ceremony on her phone, texting updates to relatives about Jason's residency match at Massachusetts General, telling anyone who would listen that her son was going to be a surgical resident at one of the most prestigious hospitals in the country, while I sat in my cap and gown, feeling invisible, despite being the one actually graduating that day. MIT had been my escape and my proving ground. 4 years from 2013 to 2017 that I'd poured myself into with the kind of desperate intensity of someone trying to justify their existence. And I'd loved it, despite the weight of my mother's constant commentary about the cost. $70,000 a year, she reminded me every time we spoke, sometimes multiple times in a single phone call, asking what I was doing that was worth that kind of investment, whether I was really taking advantage of all the opportunities, whether I understood the sacrifice she and my father were making. Jason's Princeton tuition had been nearly identical, and his medical school was costing another $60,000 annually, but those numbers were never discussed with the same tone of begrudging resentment, never wielded as evidence of disappointment. I'd thrown myself into my computer science courses, spending long nights in the Stata Center, working on projects that felt like puzzles I was uniquely designed to solve, building algorithms and systems that clicked together in my mind with a clarity I'd never found anywhere else. My junior year, I'd built a prototype for a scheduling optimization system that one of my professors said showed real commercial potential, and I'd been so excited when I called my mother to tell her about it, thinking maybe this would be the thing that made her see me differently. She'd listened for maybe 30 seconds before cutting me off to tell me that Jason had just been published in a medical journal, a case study from his research assistant position, and wouldn't that be wonderful to mention at Diwali dinner with the relatives? I'd built 3 more prototypes that year, each one more sophisticated than the last, teaching myself machine learning frameworks and natural language processing on top of my regular coursework, working with a small team of other students who shared my vision that technology could do more than just connect people on social media or sell them products they didn't need. We'd entered competitions, won a few, placed in others, and I'd started to see the outline of what I wanted to do with my life, the way I wanted to build things that solved real problems. But when I tried to explain this to my mother during winter break of my senior year, she'd physically waved her hand in dismissal and said, "Maya, these little hobby projects are fine, but what are you going to do for a career? Do you have job interviews lined up? Real positions at real companies?" I'd had 3 offers by March of senior year, including one from Google with a starting salary of $127,000, which I'd thought might finally prove something, but my mother's response had been to point out that Jason's residency salary was only $58,000, and wasn't it shallow of me to focus on money when Jason was going to be saving lives? The contradiction of her criticizing my earning potential while simultaneously dismissing my actual earnings was something I was still young enough to try to argue with back then. Still naive enough to think that logic might penetrate the wall of her predetermined narrative about which of her children mattered. I'd taken the Google offer and spent 2 years there, 2017 to 2019, learning how real tech companies operated at scale. But the entire time I'd been building something on the side, nights and weekends in my tiny studio apartment in Mountain View, a project that had started as a way to solve a problem I'd noticed in how small businesses manage their customer relationships. By the time I was 24, in early 2019, I'd saved $47,000 from my Google salary, and I'd made a decision that I knew my mother would see as insane, which was to quit my stable, well-paying job to work on my startup full-time, and I'd been right about her reaction. When I told her during a phone call in March, explained that I had a working prototype and interest from potential clients and a vision for how this could become something real, she'd actually laughed. Not a warm laugh, but the sharp, dismissive sound she made when she thought someone was being ridiculous. And she'd said, "Maya, do you know how many people try to start companies and fail? You have a good job. Why would you throw that away to sit in your apartment playing entrepreneur?" I'd tried to explain the market opportunity, the gap I'd identified, the validation I'd already received, but she'd cut me off to say that Jason had just been promoted to chief resident, and maybe I should think about stability the way my brother did, think about building something respectable instead of chasing fantasies. My father had been quieter about it, had taken me to dinner at a French restaurant in Westchester when I came home that spring to get the last of my stored belongings, and he'd told me he thought I was brave, that he admired my conviction, but then he'd also said I should have a backup plan, should keep applying to jobs just in case, and I could see in his eyes that he didn't really believe I'd succeed, that he was already bracing for my failure so he could soften the landing. I'd worked on Stratum CRM for 18 months in that studio apartment, living on my savings and ramen, and the kind of focused determination that came from knowing I had something to prove even if I couldn't articulate to whom. My mother told relatives I was between jobs, which I learned when my aunt called to offer to connect me with a friend who was hiring administrative assistants, clearly trying to be helpful based on whatever story my mother had told her. I'd landed my first paying client in month 4, a small marketing agency that paid $200 a month for the service, which felt like a fortune because it was validation that someone would actually pay for what I'd built. By month 10, I had 40 clients and $12,000 in monthly recurring revenue, and by month 15, I had 200 clients and had hired my first employee, a brilliant developer named Marcus, who believed in the vision enough to take a chance on a 25-year-old founder working out of a cramped apartment. The acquisition offer came in August of 2020, just after I'd turned 26, from a larger CRM company that saw what we'd built and wanted to integrate our technology into their platform, and the number was $2.3 million, more money than I'd ever imagined having, enough to validate every risk I'd taken and every hour I'd poured into the company. I never told my mother, never even mentioned that anything had happened beyond letting the company go, and when she asked about it months later in a tone that assumed failure, I'd just said it hadn't worked out and changed the subject, because I'd already learned by then that her approval wasn't coming no matter what I achieved, and I wasn't going to give her the opportunity to diminish something I was proud of, or find some way to make $2.3 million sound like less than Jason's resident salary. The decision to keep my success private after the Stratum CRM acquisition wasn't made all at once, but settled over me gradually during the fall of 2020. A quiet understanding that I was done offering pieces of my achievement up for my mother's inspection, only to watch her dismiss them or ignore them or find ways to make them smaller than they were. I'd taken 3 months after the acquisition closed to decompress, to travel a little, to think about what I wanted to do next, and during that time my mother called twice, both times to ask if I'd found a job yet, her tone suggesting she was bracing herself to hear that I was still unemployed, still floating without direction, still the disappointing daughter who'd thrown away a good Google position for a failed experiment. I never corrected her assumption that Stratum CRM had simply dissolved into nothing, never mentioned the 7 figures sitting in my bank account, because I'd learned that sharing good news with her only created an opportunity for her to diminish it, and I'd decided I was done volunteering for that particular form of pain. The idea for MedAI solutions came during a conversation with a friend from MIT whose sister was a nurse and who'd spent an entire dinner party complaining about the absolute chaos of hospital scheduling systems. The way doctors couldn't access patient records efficiently, the medication errors that happened because information didn't flow properly between departments. And I'd gone home that night with my mind spinning with possibilities, seeing the intersection of everything I'd learned about optimization and AI and user interface design. I incorporated the company in January of 2021, invested $800,000 of my own money from the acquisition, and hired a small team of 4 people who were brilliant and hungry, and believed that healthcare technology didn't have to be the clunky nightmare it currently was, that we could build something better, something that would actually help the doctors and nurses and administrators who were drowning in inefficient systems. My mother knew I was doing something with computers again, because my father had asked directly, and I'd given him a vague answer, but as far as she was concerned, I was unemployed. A narrative she apparently found more comfortable than investigating what I was actually doing with my time. I learned about her version of my life through a cousin who called in March of 2021 to cheerfully tell me she'd heard I was between opportunities, and did I want her to ask her husband's firm if they needed any IT help. And the humiliation of that moment, of understanding that my mother was telling our extended family I was jobless while I was working 80-hour weeks building a company that already had letters of intent from 3 major hospital systems, was sharp enough that I had to sit down on my apartment floor after the call ended. I stopped going to family gatherings after that, making excuses about being busy, about having work commitments, which my mother accepted readily because in her mind I didn't have real work, so she probably thought I was just being difficult or antisocial, and the distance was both painful and liberating, giving me space to build something extraordinary, while carrying the loneliness of knowing my own family had no idea who I actually was. By the end of 2021, MedAI Solutions had 12 employees and contracts with 15 hospitals and $3.2 million in revenue. And by the middle of 2022, we'd raised a Series A round of $15 million from a top-tier venture capital firm, and I'd been invited to speak at 2 major healthcare technology conferences, and through all of it my mother told people I was still figuring things out, a phrase I heard third-hand enough times that it became almost funny in its complete disconnection from reality, this image of me as a perpetual wanderer while I was building something that was starting to reshape how hospitals operated. The email from Forbes arrived on a Tuesday morning in early June 2023, 3 months before that disastrous dinner. And I'd been in back-to-back meetings all morning, so I didn't see it until almost 2 in the afternoon, when I finally had 15 minutes to breathe and check my personal inbox, and the subject line read, Forbes 30 Under 30 Healthcare Feature, which made my heart do something complicated in my chest, because I knew what Forbes 30 Under 30 was. Everyone in tech knew what it was, and the idea that they were reaching out to me felt surreal in a way I couldn't quite process. The editor, a woman named Jennifer Kowalski, explained that MedAI Solutions had been on their radar for the past year, that they'd been tracking our growth and our impact on hospital efficiency metrics and patient outcomes, and that they wanted to feature me in their annual 30 Under 30 list in the healthcare technology category, which would involve an interview, a professional photo shoot, and a detailed write-up about the company and my vision for the future of healthcare AI. I'd sat in my office for 10 minutes after reading that email, just staring at the screen, thinking about what it meant to be recognized by Forbes, to have your work validated at that level, to be put on a list with people who were genuinely changing their industries, and then I'd thought about calling my mother to tell her, and had felt the familiar twist of knowing that somehow she'd find a way to diminish it, or make it about Jason, or just not care enough to understand what it meant. The interview happened 2 weeks later over video call. 90 minutes of questions about my background and my vision and the specific technical innovations that made MedAI Solutions different from the dozens of other healthcare tech companies trying to solve similar problems. And I'd talked about the machine learning algorithms we'd developed and the user interface design principles that made our platform intuitive enough that busy doctors actually used it, and the $45 million valuation we'd reached after our Series B funding closed in April. The photo shoot was in late June at a studio in Soma, professional lighting and a makeup artist and a photographer who'd shot half the tech founders I'd ever read about. And I'd worn a navy blazer and felt simultaneously like an imposter, and like I was finally being seen for who I'd actually become. This person who'd built something real and valuable while her family thought she was still figuring her life out. The article went live on the Forbes website on July 15, 2023, with my photo and the headline, 30 Under 30 Healthcare. Maya Patel's AI platform is saving hospitals, millions while improving patient care. And I'd read it 3 times sitting at my desk, seeing my story told by someone who understood what I'd built, who recognized the significance of 200 hospitals using our platform and $23 million in annual revenue, and the 3 patents we held on our core technology. I'd printed 1 copy of the magazine when the physical edition came out in August, had held it in my hands and seen my face on that glossy page and felt proud and sad at the same time. Proud of what I'd accomplished, and sad that I had no one to share it with who'd watched me struggle through the building of it. And I'd put that magazine in my desk drawer at the office and never mentioned it to my parents. Never sent them the link or brought it up during my increasingly rare phone calls with my mother, because I'd learned by then that seeking her approval was like pouring water into a bucket with no bottom, pointless and exhausting, and ultimately just another opportunity for disappointment. The dinner invitation came on a Wednesday evening in late September, 2 weeks before the dinner that would change everything. My mother's voice on the phone carrying that particular tone of forced cheerfulness she used when she wanted something. And I'd been in my office reviewing a presentation for a potential client when her call came through, and I'd almost sent it to voicemail before deciding to answer because we hadn't spoken in 6 weeks, and some small part of me still hoped for connection despite years of evidence suggesting I should know better. Maya, I'm having dinner with Richard Chen, my boss from the firm, 2 weeks from Friday, she'd said, skipping past any greeting or inquiry about my life. And he wants to meet the family, said it would be nice to get to know us outside the office, so your father and I are taking him to the Capitol Grill in Manhattan, the one on 42nd. You know it? I'd known it. An upscale steakhouse where entrees started at $60 and the wine list was deliberately intimidating. The kind of place my mother loved because it announced status before anyone said a word, and I'd felt the familiar wariness settle over me because dinner invitations from my mother always came with conditions and complications, little traps I didn't see until I was already caught in them. I'm not sure I'm free that night, Mom, I'd said, pulling up my calendar even though I knew I'd probably clear it if she pushed hard enough. That same old pattern of hoping this time would be different. This time she'd see me clearly, even though 3 years of keeping my success private should have taught me that her ability to see me had nothing to do with what I achieved, and everything to do with narratives she'd decided on when I was too young to challenge them. You need to be there, she'd said, her voice sharpening the way it always did when I didn't immediately comply. Richard specifically mentioned wanting to meet both my children, and Jason's flying in from Boston, taking time out of his surgical schedule, so you can certainly make time for one family dinner. The implicit comparison was there like always, Jason sacrificing his important time, while I presumably had nothing but empty hours to fill, and I'd closed my eyes and thought about saying no, about protecting myself from whatever diminishment would inevitably happen if I sat at that table. But then she'd added, just please, Maya, don't talk about your little computer things. It's embarrassing trying to explain what you do to someone like Richard who works in serious finance. Just let Jason talk about his work at Mass General and try to be normal for one evening. And the casual cruelty of it, the assumption that my work was something shameful to hide while my brother's career deserved celebration, had hit me with such familiar force that I'd actually laughed, a short bitter sound I'd had to cover with a cough. I'd agreed to the dinner anyway, told myself I was going for my father, who'd been even quieter than usual the last few times we'd talked, told myself I could sit through one meal without needing my mother's approval, without caring that she had no idea I'd built something extraordinary while she told people I was still figuring my life out. And I'd marked it in my calendar with a sense of resignation that felt like grief, already knowing it would be painful, but not yet understanding it would also be the night everything finally broke open. The appetizers arrived exactly 20 minutes after we'd been seated, 3 orders of the restaurant's signature crab cakes and 1 Caesar salad for my mother, who always ordered something light first so she could maintain the fiction that she ate delicately, even though I'd watched her consume entire baskets of bread when no one important was watching. And the moment the server stepped away, my mother launched into what I'd come to think of as the Jason Chronicle. That familiar recitation of my brother's accomplishments, delivered with the kind of pride she'd never once directed toward anything I'd done. Her voice carrying across our corner table loud enough that the couple dining 10 feet away glanced over with polite interest. Jason just completed the most remarkable surgery last Tuesday, she said, looking directly at Richard Chen, who sat across from her with the patient expression of someone who'd learned to endure his employees' family stories. A 7-hour procedure on a patient everyone else said was inoperable, some kind of complex cardiac situation I can't begin to understand, but the chief of surgery at Mass General told Jason it was some of the finest work he'd seen in 30 years. She paused to sip her wine, a $30 glass of Chardonnay she'd ordered without looking at the price, because Richard was paying, and my mother never missed an opportunity to take advantage of someone else's expense account, then continued. He's being considered for a teaching position, can you imagine? Only 31 years old, and they want him training the next generation of surgeons. We're so incredibly proud of what he's accomplished. Richard nodded politely, and I watched my father study his crab cake with intense focus. That familiar retreat he'd perfected over 30 years of marriage, the art of being present but not really there. And I felt something tight in my chest that might have been anger, or might have been the exhausted resignation of someone who'd stopped expecting anything different. That's very impressive, Richard said, and I could hear the genuine warmth in his voice, because Jason's accomplishments were genuinely impressive. I'd never denied that, had never resented my brother for being good at what he did. Only resented that his success somehow required my failure in my mother's narrative of the world. Richard turned slightly toward me, his expression shifting to polite interest, the kind of look you give someone at a dinner party when you're trying to include everyone in the conversation, and he said, "And Maya, your mother mentioned you work in technology. What exactly do you do?" I'd opened my mouth to answer, had been ready to give some vague response that wouldn't violate my mother's explicit instructions to not embarrass her with my little computer things, when my mother laughed, actually laughed, a light dismissive sound that made the tightness in my chest transform into something sharper and harder to breathe around. "Maya's still trying to figure things out," she said, reaching for a crab cake she'd claimed she didn't want. "Not everyone can be as successful as Jason. Some people need more time to find their path. And that's fine. We can't all be surgeons." The words landed on the table like something toxic, and I saw Richard's eyebrows rise slightly, watched him glance at me with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been secondhand embarrassment, and I thought about all the things I could say, all the ways I could correct her. But instead I just reached for my water glass and took a long drink and told myself I could survive 2 more hours of this dinner before I'd never have to do it again. Richard set down his fork and leaned forward slightly, his expression carrying genuine interest that made me think he was probably good at his job because he had that quality of making you feel listened to. And he said, "Actually, I've been following the tech sector pretty closely, especially healthcare technology, since the firm has been looking at some investments in that space. Fascinating innovations happening right now with AI and machine learning applications." My mother's jaw tightened in that way I recognized from decades of observation, that tiny muscle movement that meant she was about to redirect a conversation that wasn't going where she wanted it to go, and she laughed again, that same dismissive sound that had been landing on me like small cuts throughout my entire life. "Oh, Richard, Maya wouldn't know anything about real tech business," she said, reaching for her wine glass with the confident carelessness of someone who'd never considered she might be wrong about anything. "She does some website work or something. I honestly can't keep track of it. She's tried so many different little projects over the years, never really sticking with anything long enough to make it successful." I watched my father's eyes drop to his plate, watched him cut his crab cake into smaller and smaller pieces that he wasn't eating. And I thought about all the times I'd seen him do this exact thing, this retreat into silverware and food arrangement, while my mother spoke, and he said nothing, did nothing, just sat there like a man who'd decided years ago that peace was worth any price, including watching his daughter be diminished at every family gathering. Richard glanced at me, and I could see the question in his expression, could see him trying to reconcile my mother's description with something that didn't quite fit, but before he could say anything, my mother continued, gaining momentum the way she always did when she had an audience, especially an audience that mattered to her professionally. I mean, she went to MIT, we paid $280,000 for that education. Can you imagine? $280,000, and she does this little freelance computer thing, won't get a real job at a real company with benefits and stability, just keeps chasing these startup dreams like she's still 22 years old. The couple at the table next to us was definitely listening now. I could see them trying to pretend they weren't, the woman cutting her steak with exaggerated focus, while her eyes stayed fixed on our table, and I felt heat rising up my neck, felt my hands start to shake slightly where they rested in my lap, and I thought about all the ways I could respond, all the things I could say, but 30 years of training kept me silent, because speaking up in my family meant drama and confrontation, and my mother playing the victim, claiming I was attacking her, making the whole thing somehow about her hurt feelings instead of her cruel words. I'd built a company worth $45 million while she told people I did website work, had revolutionized healthcare AI while she described my career as little projects, had been featured in Forbes magazine while she complained about the money wasted on my education, and sitting there in that expensive restaurant with her boss watching, and my father silent, and the weight of years of dismissal pressing down on me. I felt something start to crack inside my chest, some dam I'd built to hold back the truth, and I knew with sudden clarity that I couldn't do this anymore. Couldn't sit through one more dinner pretending her words didn't land, couldn't protect her from the reality of who I'd become while she was busy being ashamed of who she imagined me to be. The server had just returned to refill water glasses when my mother leaned back in her chair with that expression I knew too well, that look of someone winding up for a final pronouncement. And she turned to Richard with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Honestly, Richard, Maya's been a waste of money since college. $280,000 for an MIT degree, and she has nothing to show for it. At least Jason made something of himself." The words came out casual and light, like she was commenting on the weather or the quality of the bread, like she hadn't just declared her daughter worthless in a restaurant full of people. And I felt the blood drain from my face, felt my hands start to shake where they gripped my napkin in my lap, felt something in my chest crack open like ice breaking on a frozen lake. The couple at the next table had stopped pretending not to listen and were staring openly now, the woman's fork frozen halfway to her mouth, and I saw an older man 2 tables over glance at my mother with an expression of clear disapproval, and the words hung in the air like something visible and toxic, waste of money, nothing to show for it. And I thought about all the times she'd said similar things in private, but never quite this directly, never quite this cruel, never in public where other people could witness the casual way she dismantled me. Richard's face had gone carefully blank in that way people's faces do when they've just witnessed something uncomfortable and are trying to figure out how to respond, and my father finally looked up from his plate, his expression stricken but still silent, still doing nothing, and I felt 30 years of accumulated hurt concentrate into this single moment. This public humiliation in an expensive Manhattan steakhouse where my mother's boss could watch her call her daughter a waste of money, where strangers could hear her reduce my MIT education to nothing, where the weight of her disappointment became a tangible thing that other people could see and judge. My hands were shaking hard enough now that I had to press them flat against my thighs, had to focus on breathing steadily because something was rising up in my throat that might have been tears or might have been words I'd swallowed for decades, and I thought about walking out, just standing up and leaving without explanation. But my body felt frozen, locked in place by years of training that said, "You don't make scenes, You don't embarrass the family. You sit quietly and take it, and smile and pretend her words don't land like blows." I watched Richard shift in his seat, watched him open his mouth like he might say something, and I saw my mother reach for her wine glass with complete confidence. No awareness at all that she'd just said something unspeakably cruel, no recognition that the other diners were staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. And in that moment, I understood with absolute clarity that she genuinely didn't see anything wrong with what she'd said. That in her mind, this was simply truth-telling, simply an accurate assessment of her disappointing daughter, and that realization hurt worse than the words themselves because it meant she'd never thought she was being cruel, had never once considered that I might be worth more than her assessment of me. Richard's expression shifted in the silence that followed my mother's pronouncement, something moving behind his eyes that looked like recognition trying to surface, and he tilted his head slightly as he looked at me with sudden, focused attention, the kind of look that said he was reassembling pieces in his mind, and then he said, "Wait, Maya," and paused, his brow furrowing. "Your last name isn't Chen, is it?" I felt my heart start to pound harder, felt something like dread mixed with inevitability rise up in my chest, because I knew what was happening, could see the moment of connection forming in his mind, and I said quietly, my voice steadier than I expected given that my hands were still shaking in my lap. "Patel. Maya Patel." Richard's eyes went wide, his whole body shifting forward in his chair with sudden energy, and he said, "Maya Patel. MedTech AI Solutions. Healthcare Platform." He was already reaching for his phone, pulling it from his jacket pocket with the quick movements of someone who needed to confirm what he was thinking, and my mother's face had gone from confident to confused, her wine glass frozen halfway back to the table. And she looked between Richard and me like we'd started speaking a language she didn't understand. "I just read about you," Richard continued, his fingers moving across his phone screen with practiced speed, scrolling through something with increasing intensity. "It was in Forbes, maybe 3 weeks ago. I remember because we were discussing it at our partners meeting, the innovation in predictive healthcare analytics." And he stopped, his eyes locked on his screen, and then he looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen directed at me during a family dinner, an expression of genuine respect mixed with something like awe, and said, "That's you. You're the Maya Patel." My mother made a small sound, something between a laugh and a protest, and reached across the table toward Richard's phone, saying, "What are you talking about? Richard? Maya doesn't—" But he was already turning the screen toward her, toward my father, toward me, even though I didn't need to see it because I knew exactly what article he'd found, knew exactly what photo they were looking at, could picture the Forbes layout with my headshot and the company logo and the headline that had felt surreal when I'd first seen it 3 months ago. I watched my mother's face as she stared at the phone, watched her mouth open slightly, watched her eyes scan the screen with increasing speed, like she was reading something that couldn't possibly be real, and my father leaned in close beside her, his expression transforming from confused to shocked as he saw whatever was displayed there, and I thought about the copy of that magazine still sitting in my desk drawer at home. The pages I'd looked at exactly once before deciding that if my own family didn't know who I was by now, a magazine article wouldn't change anything. But here in this moment with Richard holding proof that I existed in a way my mother couldn't dismiss, I felt something shift inside me, some fundamental change in the dynamic that had governed my entire life. Richard held the phone steady, where both my parents could see it clearly, and he began reading aloud in a voice that carried across our table and probably to the neighboring ones too. 30 under 30. Tech visionaries reshaping healthcare. And he paused, looking at me with something like vindication in his eyes before continuing. Maya Patel, founder and CEO of MedTech AI Solutions, has developed a revolutionary artificial intelligence platform that's transforming how hospitals predict and prevent patient complications. And my mother's hand shot across the table to grab the phone from him, her fingers wrapping around it with desperate urgency, her eyes scanning the screen with an expression I'd never seen before, something between disbelief and panic, while my father leaned in so close their heads were nearly touching, both of them staring at whatever image was displayed there, and I knew without looking that it was the photo from the shoot. The one where I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows in our office with the Manhattan skyline behind me, wearing the navy blazer I'd bought specifically for the occasion, looking every inch the successful CEO my mother had just declared I wasn't. Richard wasn't finished reading, his voice taking on an almost pointed quality now as he continued with pieces he clearly remembered. Her platform is currently used by over 200 hospitals nationwide, with documented improvements in patient outcomes and significant cost reductions. And he looked up from his own mental recollection. The article mentioned your company valuation at $45 million, and I remember discussing it with our healthcare investment team because we've been looking at similar technologies. And my mother made a small choking sound, her face having gone from its usual composed expression to something pale and shocked, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to speak but couldn't find words, and my father had taken the phone from her shaking hands and was holding it close to his face, his eyes moving across the screen as he read what I assumed was the full article, the piece I'd been interviewed for over video call while sitting in my apartment. The same apartment my mother had once called depressing when she'd visited briefly 2 years ago, and told me I should consider moving back home until I found real employment. I watched my father's face transform as he read, watched understanding dawn in his expression, along with something that looked painfully like regret. And he kept scrolling, kept reading, his finger moving down the screen to take in what I knew were the details about the technology. The interviews with hospital administrators praising the platform, the sidebar about my background at MIT and my previous startup exit, and Richard was saying, I actually brought your platform up in our last partners meeting. Maya, we're very interested in the healthcare AI space. Treating me now like the professional I'd always been, like someone whose work mattered, whose achievements were real, and the contrast with my mother's waste of money comment from 3 minutes ago hung in the air like something physical and ugly that everyone at the table could feel. And I sat very still, my hands no longer shaking but folded calmly in my lap, watching my parents confront for the first time the reality of who their daughter actually was, and feeling something like power settle into my bones. Richard set his phone down on the table with a decisive gesture and looked at me with the focused attention of someone who knew exactly what questions to ask, and he said, Maya, I'd love to understand more about your predictive analytics model. We've been looking at several platforms, but the accuracy rates we've seen have been inconsistent at best. And I felt something shift inside me, felt the professional version of myself that I'd kept hidden from my family for 3 years rising to the surface. And I answered clearly, my voice steady and confident in a way it never was at family gatherings. Our platform uses a multi-layered neural network that processes patient data in real time, pulling from electronic health records, vital signs, lab results, and even nursing notes to identify pattern deviations that typically precede complications by 6 to 12 hours. And Richard nodded, leaning forward with genuine interest, and my mother sat frozen beside him, her hand still clutched around her wineglass, her face pale, while my father had finally looked up from the phone, his eyes fixed on me like he was seeing a stranger, and Richard asked, What's your current hospital deployment at? And I said, 217 hospitals across 38 states, with another 43 in implementation phases. Watching my mother's expression shift from shock to something that looked almost like she might be sick, and Richard said, That's remarkable penetration for a platform that's only, 3 years old? And I nodded, saying, 2.5 years since full commercial launch, though we had 18 months of pilot programs before that. And he asked about revenue, the kind of direct question that would have seemed rude in any other context, but here was simply professional due diligence, and I answered without hesitation. 23 million in annual recurring revenue as of last quarter, with projected growth to 35 million by year end. And my father made a sound, something between a gasp and a cough, and I watched him look at my mother, whose face had gone from pale to flushed, whose mouth was opening and closing like she wanted to interrupt but couldn't find the words, and Richard continued, I heard rumors about a significant funding round, And I confirmed. Series B closed 2 months ago, $60 million led by Sequoia with participation from several healthcare-focused funds. And the number hung in the air, $60 million, more money than my mother would see in 10 lifetimes, more validation than any daughter should need. And Richard was nodding like this all made perfect sense, saying, I saw you're speaking at the Healthcare Innovation Summit in Boston next month. And I said yes, a keynote about AI ethics in clinical settings. And he mentioned my board position at a digital health nonprofit, and the 3 patents I held. And with each detail that emerged, I watched my mother shrink further into her chair, watched the reality of who I actually was, dismantle everything she'd said about me, every dismissive comment, every waste of money accusation. And I felt powerful and sad at the same time, felt vindicated and hollow, because this conversation I was having with Richard was one I'd wanted to have with my parents for years. This recognition of my work as real and valuable and important. But instead I was having it with a stranger, while my mother sat 3 feet away realizing that her daughter, the one she'd been publicly humiliating for the past hour, was exactly the kind of success story she'd always wanted, just not in the package she'd expected or bothered to notice. My mother's voice cut through the moment with the defensive sharpness I'd heard 1,000 times before, that particular tone she used when she'd been caught in something she couldn't quite explain away, and she said, Well, Maya never told us about any of this, gesturing at Richard's phone where my Forbes photo was still visible, her hand moving in a dismissive wave like this somehow absolved her of the past 30 minutes of cruelty, like the fact that she didn't know made it acceptable to call me a waste of money in front of her boss and half the restaurant. And I felt something inside me shift, felt the careful control I'd maintained for years start to crack, not with anger exactly, but with something clearer and colder. And Richard looked uncomfortable now, his eyes moving between my mother and me, clearly realizing he'd stumbled into something far more complex and painful than he'd anticipated. And I could see him starting to understand that this wasn't just a mother who didn't know about her daughter's success, but a mother who had never bothered to ask, never cared enough to look. And I set down my water glass with deliberate care and said, my voice steady and clear in a way that surprised even me, I stopped sharing 3 years ago, Mom. And I watched her face register the words, watched her mouth open to interrupt, but I continued before she could. I stopped sharing after you told your book club I was unemployed while I was actually in the middle of closing a $15 million Series A funding round. And the specificity of the detail seemed to hit her like something physical, her face flushing. And my father's head snapped toward her with an expression I'd never seen before, something between shock and anger, and Richard had gone very still, his professional mask slipping to show genuine discomfort. And my mother said, I never said you were unemployed, I said you were between projects, using that same tone she always used when rewriting history to suit her narrative. But I shook my head, feeling 3 years of silence breaking open inside me, and I said, You told Priya's mother that I was living off savings, and you were worried I'd have to move back home. And when she asked what I was doing, you said I was unemployed and figuring things out. And I watched my mother's face go pale, because she knew Priya's mother, knew that I would have heard this story, knew she'd been caught in the exact words, and the table had gone silent except for the ambient noise of the restaurant around us, other conversations and the clink of silverware and the low music that suddenly seemed too loud. And I could feel eyes on us from neighboring tables, could sense that our drama had become entertainment for strangers. But I found I didn't care anymore, found that the shame I'd always felt about my mother's dismissal had transformed into something else entirely. And Richard cleared his throat quietly and said, Perhaps we should, but he didn't finish the sentence because there was nothing to say, no way to smooth over what had been revealed. And my mother tried again, her voice higher now, strained. Maya, you're being dramatic. I was just trying to explain why you weren't at family events. And the justification was so absurd, so perfectly encapsulating everything wrong between us that I almost laughed. I found that once I started speaking the words I'd kept silent for 3 years, I couldn't stop them. They came pouring out with the force of accumulated truth that had been dammed up too long. And I continued, my voice still steady, but carrying an edge now that cut through the restaurant noise. Do you remember when I called you about landing my first major hospital contract, Mom? It was Seattle Grace Medical Center, a 3-year agreement worth $4 million. And I was so excited I called you from the parking lot right after the signing. And I watched her face as the memory clearly didn't register, watched her scramble to place this moment I'd carried for years. And I said, "You talked for about 30 seconds, said you were busy with book club, and hung up." And the specificity seemed to hit her because her mouth opened slightly, and I continued. Or the Thanksgiving 2 years ago when Uncle Raj asked what I was working on, and you laughed and said I was playing on computers. Made this joke about how some people have real careers and some people play games. And my father's face had gone gray now, his eyes moving between my mother and me, and I could see him trying to remember these moments, trying to reconcile the daughter he thought he knew with the one sitting before him. And Richard had pushed his chair back slightly, like he wanted to create distance from what was unfolding, but couldn't leave without making it worse. And I said, my voice carrying to the tables around us now, not shouting but clear and firm. And then there was Christmas, just 8 months ago, when you gave Jason a Rolex, a $15,000 watch to celebrate his promotion to head of surgery. And I watched my mother's hand move instinctively to her throat, a defensive gesture I'd seen 1,000 times, and I continued. And you gave me a $200 Visa gift card and said, in front of the entire family, "This is for necessities, until you get a real job and can support yourself." And the memory of that moment hung between us, the way my cousins had looked away in embarrassment, the way Jason had tried to change the subject, the way I'd smiled and thanked her and gone home and cried for 2 hours before returning to work on a platform that was already serving 60 hospitals and generating $12 million in revenue. And my father said quietly, his voice rough, "Maya, I don't remember it like that." And I turned to him, feeling something crack in my chest, because his ignorance somehow hurt worse than my mother's act of cruelty. And I said, "I know you don't, Dad, because you weren't paying attention either. You just sat there like you always do, like you're doing now, letting her define reality while I disappeared." And my mother tried again, her voice shaking now. "You're making this sound worse than it was. I was trying to motivate you. And the justification was so absurd, so perfectly characteristic of her inability to take responsibility that I felt something like pity mixing with my anger, and I said, 'Motivate me to what, Mom? I was already successful. I was already building something meaningful. You just never bothered to look.'" The silence that followed my last words felt dense and charged, the kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of every ambient sound in the restaurant. And I became conscious that our table wasn't the only one paying attention anymore. Could feel the weight of curious stares from the diners around us, who had witnessed at least parts of this confrontation. And my mother seemed to realize it too, because her eyes darted around the room with something like panic, her professional composure completely shattered. And that's when a young woman approached our table, hesitating slightly at the edge of our obvious family drama, and she said, "I'm so sorry to interrupt." Her voice apologetic but determined, and she looked directly at me, ignoring my mother entirely, and continued, "But I couldn't help overhearing, and I just have to say something." And my mother's face went from flushed to pale, clearly mortified that strangers had witnessed her humiliation. And the woman turned to me and said, "You're Maya Patel, right? From MedTech AI Solutions?" And I nodded, suddenly exhausted, but also curious, and she smiled, a genuine expression of warmth and gratitude, and said, "I'm Jennifer Torres. I'm the Chief Administrative Officer at Presbyterian Downtown. We implemented your platform 14 months ago." And I remembered the contract, remembered the implementation process, the training sessions with their staff, and Jennifer continued, speaking not just to me now but to the table, to my parents, to Richard who was watching with interest. Your system saved our facility $3.2 million last year, but more importantly, it improved our patient outcomes by 40%. And she emphasized the number, letting it hang in the air. And my mother's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out, and Jennifer went on, her voice gaining strength. We've had fewer diagnostic errors, faster treatment protocols, better resource allocation, and honestly, it's transformed how we operate. And she looked at my mother then, seeming to understand the dynamic at our table, and said directly to her, "Your daughter's work is saving lives, actual human lives, every single day. She's one of the most brilliant people in healthcare technology." And the validation from this stranger, this professional who had no reason to lie or exaggerate, hit differently than Richard's recognition or even the Forbes article, because this was someone describing real-world impact, measurable results, lives changed and saved. And my mother sat frozen, her face a mask of shock, and something that might have been shame, and my father was staring at Jennifer like she'd appeared from another dimension, and Richard nodded slowly and said, "Presbyterian Downtown, you're the facility that won the Healthcare Innovation Award last quarter. I read about your diagnostic AI integration." And Jennifer smiled and said, "That was all Maya's platform." And she turned back to me and said, "I just wanted to thank you, and to say that what you've built matters. It really matters." And then she glanced around our table, at the obvious tension in my mother's stricken expression, and she added quietly, just to me, "And I hope your family knows how lucky they are," before excusing herself and returning to her own table across the restaurant. And the silence she left behind was somehow more profound than before, heavy with the weight of undeniable third-party testimony, and I watched my mother's face cycle through expressions I couldn't quite name, shock and embarrassment, and something that might have been the first glimmer of real understanding. And Richard cleared his throat and said, almost gently, "Jennifer's facility is one of the most respected in the region. Her word carries significant weight in healthcare administration circles, confirming what we'd all just heard, validating the validator," and my father's hands were shaking slightly as he reached for his water glass. And I sat there feeling strangely disconnected from the moment, watching my mother grapple with reality colliding forcefully with the narrative she'd constructed about her disappointing daughter. The silence that followed Jennifer's departure felt different from the earlier silences, heavier somehow, saturated with the weight of incontrovertible truth that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. And I watched Richard shift in his seat, his discomfort palpable now as he realized he'd been invited to witness a family dynamic that was far more toxic than he'd anticipated, and he cleared his throat and said, "I think I should perhaps give you all some privacy." His voice carefully neutral, but his eyes sympathetic when they met mine briefly, and my mother made a small sound of protest, probably realizing that her boss leaving meant she'd have to actually deal with what had just happened without the buffer of professional courtesy. But Richard was already standing, placing his napkin on the table with deliberate care, and he said, "Thank you for dinner, Susan," addressing my mother with a formality that hadn't been there at the beginning of the evening, and then to me, "Ms. Patel, it was truly an honor to meet you. Your work is remarkable." And the contrast between how he addressed my mother versus how he addressed me wasn't lost on anyone at the table, and then he was gone, walking toward the exit with the purposeful stride of someone escaping an uncomfortable situation. And the four of us, my mother and father and the empty chair where Richard had sat, and me, remained in a silence that felt suffocating, and I could hear my own breathing, could hear the conversations at other tables resuming after the drama of the past few minutes, could hear the clink of silverware and the murmur of the restaurant returning to its normal rhythm, while our table sat frozen in the aftermath of revelation. And finally my father spoke, his voice rough and low, almost breaking. "Maya, I didn't know. I should have paid more attention. I should have asked you about your work, really asked, not just surface questions." And I looked at him, at this man who had raised me but had never really protected me from my mother's cruelty, who had sat silent through years of dismissal and comparison and casual emotional abuse. And I felt something complex twist in my chest. Not quite forgiveness, but not quite anger either. Something more like sad recognition of his weakness, his inability to stand up to his wife even when his daughter needed him to. And my mother made a sound then, something between a laugh and a gasp. And she said, her voice defensive and sharp, "This is ridiculous. You're all acting like I'm some kind of monster. I was just trying to keep you grounded, Maya, trying to make sure you had realistic expectations." And the justification was so transparent, so clearly a scrambling attempt to rewrite history in real time. And I felt the calm that comes from years of therapy, from learning to recognize manipulation tactics, from understanding that other people's dysfunction wasn't my responsibility to fix. And I said quietly, "You called me a waste of money, Mom, tonight, in front of your boss in a restaurant full of strangers. You said I had nothing to show for my MIT degree while I'm running a $45 million company." And she flinched at the number, at the concrete specificity she couldn't argue with. And she tried again, switching tactics, her voice going softer, almost pleading. "Well, how was I supposed to know any of this if you never told me?" And the attempted reversal, the implication that somehow her ignorance was my fault, would have worked on me years ago, would have made me feel guilty for not trying harder to earn her approval, but I'd done enough work on myself to recognize it for what it was. I looked at my mother across the table, at this woman who had shaped so much of my early life, who had the power to wound me with just a few words for so many years, and I felt something shift inside me, a final letting go of the hope that she would ever be the mother I needed, and I said, my voice steady and clear, "I stopped telling you about my life 3 years ago, Mom. And do you want to know why? It wasn't because I was unsuccessful or ashamed. It was because every single time I tried to share something I was proud of, you found a way to diminish it." And she opened her mouth to protest, but I continued, not angry now, just tired and honest. "When I called you to say I'd secured my first major hospital contract, a $2 million deal that validated everything I'd been working toward, you said, 'That's nice, dear,' and then spent 20 minutes telling me about Jason's new house." And my father winced at the memory, or maybe at hearing it described so plainly, and I went on. "When I tried to tell you about the patents I'd filed, the actual intellectual property I'd created that was worth millions, you changed the subject to ask if I was dating anyone because at least marriage would be an accomplishment you could explain to your friends." And my mother's face was doing something complicated, cycling between defensiveness and what might have been shame, and I realized that I didn't need her to understand, didn't need her to apologize or validate my feelings, because I'd already done the work of validating myself, and I said, "The Forbes article, the Series B funding, the 200 hospitals using my platform, none of that happened in the last month, Mom. I've been building this for years while you told everyone I was figuring things out." And I let that sink in, let her sit with the reality of how completely she'd misunderstood her own daughter's life. And then I said the thing I'd needed to say for years. I didn't need Richard to recognize me tonight. I didn't need Jennifer to testify about my impact. I already knew what I'd accomplished and what I was worth. And my voice got quieter but firmer. "But what happened tonight? You calling me a waste of money in public, in front of your boss and strangers. That crossed a line I can't ignore anymore." And my mother started to speak, but I held up my hand, not aggressive but clear. "I'm not doing this anymore. The family dinners where I'm the disappointment. The holidays where Jason gets celebrated and I get condescended to. The constant narrative that I'm somehow less than because my success doesn't look like what you expected." And I saw my father's eyes fill with tears, saw him recognize perhaps for the first time the cumulative weight of years of dismissal, and I continued, "I'm setting a boundary, and it's not negotiable. No more family gatherings until you can treat me with basic respect, not because of Forbes or company valuations, but because I'm your daughter, and I deserve better than to be called a waste of money." And the words hung in the air between us, clear and final, and I felt something like peace settle over me, the peace that comes from finally speaking truth that's been building for years, from choosing myself over the desperate hope for parental approval. I stood up, the movement smooth and deliberate, and I reached for my purse where I'd hung it on the back of my chair. And the action seemed to break whatever spell had held the table in stasis, because my mother's face shifted from complicated defensiveness to something sharper, something that looked almost like panic. And she said quickly, "Wait, Maya, don't leave. We need to talk about this. We can work this out." And I noticed the shift in her tone, the sudden urgency that hadn't been there when she was justifying her behavior. And I realized with a clarity that felt almost detached that she wasn't panicking because she'd hurt me. She was panicking because her boss had just witnessed her systematically belittling her successful daughter, because there would be social and professional consequences to what had happened tonight. Because Richard would go back to the office and the story would spread. The managing director whose daughter was in Forbes while she called her a waste of money, and the recognition of her motivation, the fact that even now her concern was primarily about optics rather than actual remorse, settled something final in my chest, and I said quietly, "There's nothing to work out tonight, Mom." And she stood too, her movements jerky and desperate, and she said, "I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry, I didn't know about any of your success. I didn't realize." And the apology was hollow, shaped by panic rather than genuine understanding, an attempt to contain the situation rather than address the years of damage. And I looked at my father, who was still sitting, his face aged a decade in the past hour. And I said to him specifically, "Dad, if you want to have lunch sometime, just the two of us, I'd like that. I'd like to try to build something real with you." And I saw relief and pain cross his face in equal measure. And he nodded, said hoarsely, "I'd like that too, Maya. I'd like to know you. The real you, not the version your mother described." And my mother made a sound of protest at that, at the implicit acknowledgement that he was choosing to see me separately from her narrative. And I turned toward the exit, and my mother reached out, her hand catching my arm, and she said desperately, "Please, Maya. People are watching. Don't make a scene." And the words were so perfectly emblematic of everything wrong between us. Her concern about appearances even in this moment, and I gently removed her hand from my arm and said, "I'm not making a scene, Mom. I'm just leaving. You're the one who made a scene when you called me a waste of money." And I walked away from the table, through the restaurant where other diners quickly looked away, pretending they hadn't been watching our family drama unfold, and I made it outside onto the Manhattan street where the autumn air was cold and sharp and clean, and I stood there for a moment breathing it in, feeling something like freedom expand in my chest, and my phone buzzed in my purse, and I pulled it out to see a text from Jason, my brother, and the message was frantic, clearly sent after my mother had texted him in panic, and it said, "Maya, Mom just told me what happened. I'm so sorry. I should have stood up for you years ago. I should have said something every time she compared us. I was a coward and I'm sorry." And I stared at the text, at this olive branch from my brother who had been held up as the golden child, who had perhaps suffered in his own way from the same dysfunction, just from a different position. And I typed back, "Thank you for saying that. It means more than you know." Because it did. Because Jason acknowledging his complicity in the family dynamic, even if just through silence, was its own form of validation. 2 months passed before I fully understood what had shifted that night at the restaurant. 2 months of careful reconstruction, where I built a life that felt authentically mine, rather than a reaction to my mother's dismissal. And the clarity came gradually, in small moments that accumulated into something like peace. The Wall Street Journal ran a feature on my company's new partnership with a consortium of 15 major hospital systems, a deal worth $120 million over 3 years that would bring our AI platform to healthcare facilities across the eastern seaboard. And the article included quotes from hospital CEOs about improved patient outcomes and reduced costs, about innovation that was changing how healthcare operated at a fundamental level. And I read it in my office on a Tuesday morning with my coffee, and felt proud, but not desperate for external validation the way I might have once felt. My father and I had lunch every Wednesday, a standing appointment that we both protected fiercely. And in those weekly meetings, I watched him discover who I actually was, watched him ask questions about my work with genuine curiosity, learn the details of my life he'd missed while staying silent through years of my mother's dismissal. And he told me once, his voice heavy with regret, "I always knew your mother was hard on you, but I didn't realize I was complicit through my silence. I didn't understand that not defending you was its own form of harm." And I appreciated his honesty, even as I recognized that some damage couldn't be entirely undone, only acknowledged and worked around. Jason and I spoke on the phone every few weeks, rebuilding a sibling relationship that had been warped by our mother's constant comparisons, and he confessed that being the golden child had been its own prison, that he'd chosen surgery partly because it was what our mother valued rather than what he loved. And there was something healing in both of us, recognizing how the same dysfunction had wounded us differently, had shaped our lives in ways we were only now beginning to untangle. My mother sent a letter 6 weeks after the dinner, a formal typed document that her therapist had clearly helped her craft, and it contained the words, "I'm sorry," and detailed acknowledgments of specific harms and a promise to do the work of understanding why she'd treated me as she had. And I read it twice and then put it in my desk drawer, not ready to respond, maybe never ready, because I'd learned that forgiveness was a choice and not an obligation. That I could release my anger without requiring reconciliation. That protecting my peace was more important than maintaining a relationship that had only ever diminished me. My life filled up with people who had chosen to be there. My leadership team who'd built something remarkable together. My mentor, Sarah, who'd believed in me when I was just a 24-year-old with an idea and audacious confidence. My friends who'd celebrated every milestone even when my family hadn't known those milestones existed. And I realized this was what family actually meant. Not shared DNA, but shared respect and mutual support, and the choice to show up for each other. I gave a keynote at a healthcare technology conference in Boston and spoke honestly about the loneliness of building success in silence, about the particular pain of family dismissal, and afterward, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes and said, "My parents think I'm wasting my life too. Thank you for showing me it's possible to keep going." And I gave her my card and told her she could email me anytime. And I meant it. Because I remembered what it felt like to be her, hungry for any evidence that success was possible, even without family belief. The girl who'd been called a waste of money had built an empire worth over $100 million, had created technology that saved lives and reduced suffering, had earned recognition from Forbes and the Wall Street Journal and the respect of her industry. But more importantly, she'd learned that none of those external validations mattered as much as the internal knowledge of her own worth. And she'd discovered that the most radical thing she could do was live her success openly. Not to prove anything to anyone, but simply because she deserved to take up space in the world without apology. And that freedom, that hard-won piece of self-acceptance, was worth more than any amount her mother had ever spent on her education or any cruel words her mother had ever used to diminish her, because she'd finally learned the truth that would carry her forward into whatever came next, that she had never needed their approval anyway.